All right. I think we will begin then. Thank you, everyone, for coming out to our first event for Focus Week. Our theme is liturgy this year, and I want to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jen Pollock Michel. Jen is the author of 4 books, Teach Us to Want, Keeping Place, Surprised by Paradox, and most recently, just last month, her book, A Habit Called Faith, came out. So you might want to check those books out. She holds a BA in French from Wheaton College and a master's in literature from Northwestern University. Currently living in Toronto. She's the lead editor for Imprint Magazine. And you can follow her on Twitter or subscribe to her monthly letter at jenpollockmichel.com. We will have Jen's presentation first, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So stick around for that. I think with that, I'll turn it over. Jen Michel.
Great. Mark, can we use the chat as well if anybody wants to? Or,
yeah, absolutely. You can leave. You can leave questions, comments there. I don't know if we will save those for the end or
okay, sure.
Respond to them in live time. It's up to you.
Yeah, I had a couple questions that I thought I might ask along the way, and if anybody wants to use the chat function for that, that would be great.
Oh yeah, awesome.
No pressure though. Yeah, I thought I would start. Great to be with you. I can't believe that last year I was actually on vacation in the Caribbean. So don't feel sorry for me, but it was actually the first beach vacation that we'd ever taken as a family. And I remember just corresponding with you guys at Spring Arbor and deciding, okay, we are canceling. So it's great to be with you, although virtually. And I hope that this is something that God will use even despite some of the technological obstacles and not feeling like I can actually be present with you today. I wanted to start just with a brief story about a man named Evan Roberts. And I'm sure none of you has heard of him. In fact, I hadn't actually heard of him until today when I had a piece of research that I wanted to use. And I thought, well, where did this, I found it in a book. And I thought, well, what exactly is that story related to this research? And I came across the story of a man named Evan Roberts, born in Wales in 1878, I think, worked in the coal mines with his father, and then apprenticed with his uncle as a blacksmith. And this is, again, not anybody that anybody here, I'm sure, would ever know. And did some theological training, felt called to the ministry, and was praying for the country of Wales for 13 years, he said, for a renewal movement, for a revival movement. And he actually came to see that in his ministry, just this movement of the Holy Spirit moving through Wales. And one of the things that happened when he was preaching at these meetings, he had sort of 4 points that he would always repeat at each of the different meetings. And it was just sort of a call, an invitation to the people who were attending to usher in, if you will, revival or spiritual renewal in their lives. And so the first thing was, first put away any unconfessed sin, confess your sin, repent, turn from your sin. The second thing was put away any doubtful habit, anything that you just sort of think, might not be a good thing to be keeping at, in my life. The third thing was just to be ready to obey the Spirit promptly. And the fourth thing was to confess Christ publicly. And I love that second thing in particular, to put away any doubtful habit. And if there's sort of a way into my talk today, it's really to think about our digital habits and to think about what may be doubtful about our digital habits. Unless some of you think that all we're going to be talking about is envy because of social media or pornography, we're not actually going to be talking about some of the more obvious, doubtful, sinful habits that our digital devices can sort of make very easy. But I hope to be able to talk about some things that may be a little bit less obvious when we think about our technology. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work. Great. So desire in a digital age. And so maybe if there's anything, in fact, I lost my chat. But as I go along, I may be asking you some questions just to sort of think about, perhaps you even want to take, God forbid, a pencil and a paper. I'm sort of a paper person, that you could sort of keep beside you and just take some jot notes down. I would encourage you, if you have a cell phone, to just, if you're not watching this presentation on your cell phone, to sort of tuck that away, in the spirit of thinking about desire in a digital age. The first thing I want to talk about is just that, let's see if that discipleship really today is digital. I mean, if we want to think about that, the bulk of our time is mediated by screens, by our smartphones, by our laptops. That means that our digital habits really are the most formative. And so we have to think about, if we want to think about being formed into the likeness of Jesus Christ, if we want to think about apprenticeship to Jesus, we have to think about our digital lives. We want to think about the doubtful habits of our digital lives, if you will. We want to think about resisting the digital formation of the world. That's something as simple as Romans 12, 1 and 2. Don't be conformed to the world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think we want to walk in step with the triune God, who actually took up embodied and emplaced life, which digital habits can sometimes pose a direct threat to. And so this is sort of my main thesis, is I want to sort of say today, it's impossible to talk about discipleship, to talk about spiritual formation apart from talking about digital formation. I mean, this is kind of the crisis, if you will, of our time. I think that I want to sort of situate the crisis in a couple of different ways. I mean, 3 ways, because I know that's sort of a big claim that, to think about spiritual formation, to think about digital formation, we're actually confronting a crisis. And what is that crisis, or what's the nature of that crisis? Well, I think the first thing is to talk about the crisis of perception. And one thing that has been really formative for me, or I should say one particular author, when I think about technology, when I think about digital formation, it's sort of impossible to ignore Neil Postman, who was, a media theorist and someone who talked a lot and wrote a lot about technology. And one of the things that he tells us, and I'm sort of at this first point here in terms of crisis of perception, he talks about technological change as being ecological. And what he means by that is that it's not as if we think about technology simply as the tools that we kind of add to our lives, the new devices that we sort of make use of, that really technological change is far more environmental. It's more ecological is how he would talk about it. So it's an altering of the context of our lives, which means that we end up with a crisis of perception, that we can't actually see the change. Just like, it's very hard to kind of note environmental changes like global warming. I mean, these things happen over a long period of time, and they're so ubiquitous that it's almost impossible to see them, perceive them, and identify them. So I've made the claim that to think about spiritual formation is to think about digital formation, and it's to think about digital examination, the examination of our digital habits. And it's to talk about digital resistance to the digital formation that's imposed upon us by the world. But how do we resist something that we can't see? And so that's sort of one piece of the crisis that I sort of want to draw out as I start. I think we also have the crisis of habituation. So how do we resist the things that we practice over and over and over again? Now, you can look up a lot of different studies and they're all going to say something slightly different, but basically the bulk of the research is saying we're looking at our phones all the time. Like, Maybe it's every 57 seconds, maybe it's every 3 minutes, but it's probably not longer than 3 minutes for so many of us. We are practicing digital habits. They're just inscribing who we are, what we want, how we perceive the world, how we think. So we have this crisis of habituation. It's become so habitual. The way that we sort of consume the world, interact with the world, engage with the world, the way that we are in the world is mediated now. How do we resist what we practice all the time? But those aren't actually even the most difficult things, because I think what we really get to is we get to a crisis of desire. And I've entitled this talk Desire in a Digital Age. And that's really where I want to go, where I want to focus is not just how do we use our tools for ill, if you will, but how do our tools and our devices actually form disordered desires in us? Maybe not form, but certainly tend, cultivate, reinforce. So we have this desire of crisis. How do we actually resist the things that we really kind of have learned to want? You know, I listened to, I think it was listened to a recent podcast interview with Ezra Klein. He's someone that I really enjoy. And I think he has a lot of curiosity about digital formation, not for the purpose of spiritual formation necessarily, more for the purpose of productivity, which is where a lot of people go when they think about digital formation. You know, it's always about how can we actually get more done? Well, we need to get off Twitter. But the interesting thing was he was interviewing Cal Newport, who is the author of Deep Work and Digital Minimalism, and most recently, A World Without Email. And he was asking Cal about the research that would suggest that we're actually far better off when we're off our devices, when we actually engage deep work, we're more productive, GDP rises, you know, companies are more profitable. And so if we can actually measure the fact that digital kind of disentanglement has all of these material benefits, why don't we choose it? Why don't we choose that kind of relationship with our technology, a relationship whereby we are more in charge of them than they are in charge of us? And it really is this question of desire, because may actually be that this world that we have, this hyperactive, superficial, um, isolating and isolated world may actually be the world that we've learned not just to accommodate or tolerate, but it may actually be the world that we want. And as Christians, we have to sort of ask ourselves, how do we want for a better world? Because that's actually not the world that God made. He didn't make an isolating, hyperactive, restless, inhuman, superficial world. And so these are the kinds of crises that I want to sort of focus on as we talk through this whole question of desire in a digital age. I am not an academic. I'm not a theological expert. I'm not even a social media influencer, which, surely doesn't credential me to give this kind of talk. But I am somebody who pays deep attention to the spiritual life, someone who writes about the spiritual life, who pays attention to the mechanics of the soul, who is rooted in scripture, and who pays attention to the conditions of our modern life to say, well, what are the forms of resistance that we actually need to practice in order to be apprenticed into the life of Jesus Christ? I think probably the thing that most qualifies me to actually give this talk is the fact that I'm a little bit old. The fact that I actually remember a world before the smartphone, before really the ubiquity of the internet even. I grew up, I'm 46. I grew up summer afternoons bored out of my mind. My parents, I can remember, sort of like late middle school, I had an older brother. So they'd leave us at home and we'd like fritter away our afternoons watching soap operas. And then when we got a little bit older, we were watching a lot of MTV. I remember going to college with a Macintosh Classic 2. Now I sort of went back and situated myself on some of the, I don't know, stats or whatever on this particular computer. 2 MB of RAM, I am told, a 9-inch black and white screen. I can remember when I was a junior in college at Wheaton, I was studying abroad for a semester in France, and I was dating a guy, and he had decided early that he was going to come and see me. He was already graduated from Wheaton, and our communication was so infrequent. We, we're literally mailing letters to each other. Like maybe very occasional phone calls because they were super expensive. And I think about like how much easier that breakup would have been because I broke up with him as soon the day that he stepped off the train to come and see me. That would have been a lot easier had we had text and email and FaceTime. I can remember my first teaching job in 1996. I had graduated from Wheaton, and I remember that a lot of the school announcements were coming through voicemail, and the administration kept reminding teachers, please don't use your voicemail. Please actually use email to communicate with each other. And now, 20 some years later, have Cal Newport trying to envision a world without email. So there, in some sense, I do feel that I have a bit of a glimpse, at least, at a former
I'm listening, huh?
where we didn't have to, I guess before the world where the smartphones were just ubiquitous, if you will. So that's the thing that qualifies.
Oh, poor Robbie. He's gonna be.
Someone may be not muted. So just in case that.
Guide to Telemental Health.
Maybe Mark can.
Do you remember seeing it?
That may be the thing that qualifies me the most to actually give this talk, is the fact that I am just old enough to remember a world before
something like that.
really before people actually had a personal computer, every single person. Here are some of the questions that I think that are really interesting to ask as we sort of spend time together today. What I've said now, I've taken kind of the postman view that technological change is ecological, which means it's really hard to see. But it does change the very conditions of our world. It doesn't just give us new tools, new devices, it changes the world in which we live. And so what are the material conditions of this new world? And then what desires are formed by those new conditions? The fact that we live in a different kind of world means that our expectations of the world have changed. And so what we want to ask ourselves is, well, what are those new expectations, those new desires? And then how are these desires counter to my apprenticeship to Jesus? Now, this is a very old idea in the sense that desire, the formation of desire, is at the heart of the project of what it means, of holy desire, I should say, is at the heart of the project of being a Christian. This is Augustine, who talked a lot about the right ordering of our loves. And so that's kind of the way I'm approaching this talk. If I can identify the new conditions of this world, the new desires and expectations that I have because of this new world, now how then are those desires counter to my formation, my spiritual formation? What habits of resistance do I need to practice? Do you need to practice? And then this final one, what will be the cost of my resistance? Because there always is a cost to resistance. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so hard. I think about, Jesus meeting the rich young ruler. What must I do to follow you? And he gives him the commands, and this man's wonderfully reassured. I've kept all of these since my youth. And Jesus says, now go sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me. And the man left sad and downcast because the cost of following Jesus was too high. And that may be something that we will find ourselves wrestling with. What will be the cost of my digital discipleship? Well, the good and possibly bad news is that we actually don't have new spiritual problems, and we don't even have new spiritual solutions. I find it super fascinating. I've been doing some work recently with the Vice tradition, which is quite old, ancient, and then of course medieval Christianity had incredible acuity and acumen to talk about the mechanics of the human person. I mean, we could talk about psychology, we could talk about this as something spiritual, but I think the point is that they developed a way of talking about how our desires are disordered. They gave us kind of categories for identifying when we were experiencing disordered desires. And so we have actually with the very first kind of vice list that we have. Now, when I talk about the ancient vices, I'm talking about the 7 deadly sins. It actually started out with the 8 deadly sins in the 4th century with Evagrius of Pontus, who was a desert father. And if you know anything about the desert fathers and mothers, they were actually fleeing the cities for the wilderness because not because just the world was worldly, but because Christianity was worldly at that time. And they wanted to practice their own habits of resistance. So we have we have Evagrius of Pontus, who develops the first list of ancient vices or deadly sins, capital vices, if you will, vices that actually give birth to other sins and other vices. And this list changes a little bit throughout the centuries until we get to Aquinas in the 13th century. But for the most part, it stays pretty much the same. We have gluttony on the list. We have lust. We have avarice or greed. We have sadness, and this is where you see sometimes sadness on the list. Eventually that becomes acedia and sloth. Those kind of get put together. Anger, wrath, acedia, sloth, and I'm going to be that's actually going to be a big focus of my talk today. We're going to talk about that. Vainglory. And then pride, and which later lists, pride sort of gets taken off the list and becomes sort of like the source for all of the other 7 sins. And then envy gets added after Evagrius several centuries later. The point is that if you actually do a little bit of homework on the 7 deadly sins, you find them to be pretty comprehensive. You know, do we really have new spiritual problems? I mean, I think that's a temptation to think about in a technological age. Well, I've said that the conditions of the world are different, but does that mean that we actually have different sins? Do we have different vices? Do we have new spiritual problems? And I actually don't think that we do. So I don't think that we need to be sort of mining, searching, excavating for kind of new sins, if you will. I actually think that we could sort of look at old lists and find a lot of help in some of those lists. I actually don't think that we have new spiritual solutions either. I mean, there's something very simple about the approach of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. And this is also repeated in Matthew chapter 18, verses 7 through 9. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. And so what is Jesus saying? So, you know, really, we don't actually have new spiritual solutions. We can't improve upon what Jesus has said. He has said, take every necessary measure. Take every extreme measure, if necessary, to avoid sin. Take these measures because you want life, not death. Because you want blessing, not curse. Recognize your own impulse to find exemption and exception with yourself, because this is actually Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He's addressing the Pharisees who say, well, isn't it enough that we don't commit adultery? And Jesus says, hey, you know what? If you've actually looked at a woman and lusted after her in your heart, you are guilty of the sin of adultery. Don't look to find exemption and exception for yourself. And this whole idea, I think, as Jesus says, tear out your eye if it causes you to sin, cut off your hand if it causes you to sin. It is to remind us that there is a painful process involved in spiritual formation. Again, to sort of connect to the idea that habits of resistance will probably feel painful and costly to us. But this is, again, to draw this idea out. We don't have new spiritual problems. We have the same sins. The human heart has really not changed in terms of its posture toward autonomy and rebellion against God. And it can look and manifest in all kinds of different ways. And we don't have new spiritual solutions. It's do whatever is necessary. Take whatever extreme measure is required to turn toward life, to turn toward Jesus. Well, we do have new conditions. And this is, I think, far more interesting for us to talk about, because again, to think about that crisis of perception. If technological change is ecological, if it's environmental, if it's changing the conditions in which we live, then it's hard to see. And so I hope that this is actually perhaps maybe one of the more insightful parts of the presentation, because I think this is something that's incredibly hard to see, perhaps easier for people to see who've not lived in the world, the smartphone world that we live in forever. We haven't lived in this forever. Now, again, I've told you, I'm not going to talk about the obvious stuff. You want to pick up your smartphone and, we could talk about lust. We could talk about Amazon and greed. We could talk about cancel culture and wrath. We could talk about vainglory and social media. And if we want to talk about doubtful habits, we could certainly, let's talk about TikTok, although I am thankful for a recent recipe that someone sent me from TikTok. But I want to talk about these ecological conditions. I want to talk about how the world has changed and how our expectations have changed of it. And I think here, first of all, I want to talk about this new world that we have and the world that we've been formed to want. And it is a world without burdens. It is a world without friction. And I mean that in the most actual physical, concrete sense, as much as I mean it in other ways too. I mean, here we are on Zoom. This is teaching us to want, we don't even want the burden of changing out of our pajamas. I mean, maybe from the waist up, but probably not from the waist down. Although I'm happy to say that I am actually wearing, real pants and not pajamas. But you can sort of imagine, to be in a technological world, we grow in our distaste for burdens. You think about Zoom. I mean, think about how easy it is now to sort of jump on Zoom, chat with a friend. You don't have to get dressed. You don't have to get in your car. You don't have to fight traffic. I didn't have to fly on an airplane or drive to Michigan from Toronto. I opened my laptop and there you all were. So you can imagine this kind of world that we're sort of now formed to want. I want a world without burdens. Think about leisure in kind of the smartphone age. It doesn't get any easier than the Netflix binge. I don't have to travel. I don't have to leave my house. Again, I don't have to get out of my pajamas. I just have to sort of click to the next episode and the next episode and the next episode. And trust me when I say that I'm not speaking as someone who doesn't struggle with this. I'm speaking exactly as someone who does. Think about ghosting as kind of relationship conflict management in a smartphone era. Again, it doesn't get any easier than, I just don't answer your text. I don't answer your call. Like, we don't have to have any awkward conversations. We don't have to have like, there's no drama. Like, literally, I just don't answer you. And then you sort of get the message that I guess this relationship is over, whether it's a friendship or a dating relationship. A world without burdens. Like, it's just so easy and effortless. And truthfully, if we're going to really get kind of personal and intimate, we could even just talk about sex. In 2018, Kate Julian in The Atlantic wrote an article called "The Sex Recession," and she's talking about all the statistics globally, really. I mean, I think this particular example that I found was in Japan, but I think it sort of is across the board, that rates of masturbation are up, rates of actual physical intercourse are down in younger generations. My generation, my parents, my grandparents, we all had more sex than you guys did at your age. And why is that? Kate Julian is actually saying in the article that 5 of the 8 reasons have to do with our technology. And there's this idea, and people actually, I think there's a word for it in Japanese now, to talk about sex being something tiresome. Like, it just can't even handle the burden of the physical burdens that are the ways that I'm encumbered because of physical intercourse. So I'm going to choose these other versions, less burdensome versions of sexual pleasure and sexual titillation. So, we actually think about our devices as gaining us kind of efficiency and time. But I think that is a short-sighted, I mean, that's one version of it, but it's short-sighted because technology is often, it's just sparing us physical effort. And so if you look at like Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian media theorist, he talked about technology acting like a prosthetic arm, that it's mechanical, it's doing things for you, it's sparing you from having to do them for yourself. And so he was extrapolating that to even like the vacuum cleaner, for example. It's a prosthetic device. Like, it's helping me, it's sparing me the bodily effort of actually having to sweep with my broom and bend over with my dustpan and then carry it over to the garbage. And so what you start to see when you think about this kind of ecological change that has been, that our technology has sort of given to us, what really becomes kind of the demons of today, the things that we want to avoid, are hassle and inconvenience and physical effort. One of my favorite statistics, now this is a little bit old, I need like a Gen Z statistic, but in 2016, 40% of millennials said, you know what, we don't even bother with eating breakfast cereal because it's too much effort. 2016, 40% of millennials say we don't eat cereal because it's too much effort. Now, in my mind, I'm like an egg person, so I can't imagine what is less effort, what's more effortless than cereal? I guess it's like a fig bar or something. You just tear the package. So this is troubling for a lot of different ways, a lot of different reasons. We're learning actually to despise bodily effort. And what would that connect back to? Now, I've talked about the ancient vices, the 7 or 8 deadly sins, depending on which list you're looking at. And what I want to introduce to you right now is just the sin of acedia, which is not a word that many of us know, we're not maybe familiar with that word. We don't really talk about it much in our spiritual formation literature. I mean, you'll find it out there. And I actually just wrote an article for Christianity Today talking about acedia and the practices of Lent. So if you're interested in that, you can look at that. But the vice of acedia is the vice that's traditionally translated as sloth. And you can see how I'm correlating this with this kind of world that we want, this world without burdens, this world without friction. It's a world that forms in us acedia, a certain kind of sloth, but it's not just physical sloth. It's not just, I can't be bothered to get up off my couch. It's that I can't be bothered with much of anything. I love how, Kathleen Norris wrote a book called Acedia and Me. And she says it's acedia is like the listlessness that kind of comes over your soul and you can't even rouse yourself to give a damn. You can't even rouse the effort to give a damn. You might not be able to give a damn about your neighbors. You might not be able to give a damn about your own family members, about the needs in your community. And it may be that you can't even give a damn about yourself and your own spiritual formation. Laura Fabrici wrote a book called Keys to Bonhoeffer's House, which is a wonderful kind of memoir-ish, as she engages with and talks about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's story. And so many of us kind of think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer as this hero of courage. We think about his moral courage. But one of the really interesting things that Laura does in her book is she looks at Dietrich Bonhoeffer and those in German society, other German Christians, and talks about the political acedia of the moment. This kind of idea that, yeah, things are probably going wrong. Yeah, there's probably injustice that people are suffering, but I can't really be bothered to care about that. And I wonder if that sounds familiar to you, because it certainly sounds familiar to me. Rebecca DeYoung wrote a book called Glittering Vices. She's at Calvin College, and she talks about acedia, and I think it's one of the best definitions of acedia, because it involves both spiritual and physical and emotional. Like it really has this kind of broad range to it. She says, acedia is resistance to the demands of love. Resistance to the demands of love. Now, so if we live in a world where we learn to want, learn to want a world without burdens, we are learning to want a world without demands. We're learning to practice acedia. We're actually learning to despise what God himself loved in the act of the incarnation. When Jesus of Nazareth took up bodily life for the salvation of humanity, took up the burdens of bodily life. So what are we going to need to do? We're going to need to practice good burdens. What one form of spiritual resistance to acedia, to the desire for a burdenless, frictionless world, is to just take up practices that actually force us to engage burdens. Now, this requires us to recover like a theology of the body, to say the body is good and physical effort is good, and, strain and strenuous effort, like these can actually be really good. It's not actually the thing that we should learn to avoid. It's the thing that we can learn to engage. I think about personally, cooking is a wonderful bodily burdensome practice. Now, again, I am not talking about breakfast cereal. I'm not talking about fig bars. I'm not even talking about maybe jarred garlic, like the whole, take up the burden of actually peeling and chopping garlic, doing something that it just requires you to move slowly, to engage friction, bodily friction with your environment. Like that can actually be a spiritual practice. You can learn to sort of slow down. You can learn not to despise that. You can learn that that is actually good. I think about caring for children. I happen to have 5 children. Probably a lot of you, most of you listening to me can't even imagine, that stage of your life, but you don't have to have a child to care for a child. You can find a family that you could care for a child and engage just good burdens of picking kids when they fall on the side, picking them up when they fall on the sidewalk, and bandaging a knee and wiping a nose and maybe wiping a butt if you have to, but caring for children is a way to engage burdens. I think friendship with the poor is a wonderful way to engage physical burdens. I have a friend who is a refugee, and I've been friends with her now for 4 or 5 years. And in my friendship with her, I've realized how many physical burdens the poor carry. It's something as simple as if you don't have a laptop and you don't have a printer and you need to get that form printed and filled out and emailed, you have to get yourself to the library in order to do that. And so to be friends with the poor is to actually engage some of those burdens. This is a friend who, during the pandemic, with her 3 young boys at home, she's a single mom, it wasn't possible to go to the grocery store during a global pandemic. And so it meant that I had to get some extra bags of groceries, and I had to make that extra trip to her house. And then because she lives in an apartment complex, I don't just pull up into her driveway. I have to walk those bags some distance, and it's a city street and there's never parking, exactly as I need it. These are good burdens just to practice, because what it does is it helps us resist our own resistance to the demands of love, because love will always require us to carry burdens. Marriage will require us to carry burdens. Friendship requires us to carry burdens. Parenting, caring for our aging parents, being a good neighbor. Love requires us to carry burdens. And this is, of course, the love of the incarnate God who took up the burden of a body and who emptied himself, became nothing, made himself a servant. I think that these are the things that I'm talking about as ways to resist acedia. We can practice good burdens. Well, another kind of, I'm going to leave that behind. So we've learned to want a world without friction, a world without burdens. And of course, technology also inscribes in us the desire for a world without bounds. We just don't want limits. And there's something about the promise of technology. Again, we're talking about ecological change. It's this whole notion that now, like, the world is just endlessly expansive and infinite. Your time is boundless. Your capacity is boundless. Your responsibility is boundless. Your influence is boundless. Your expertise is boundless. And this is, again, just this, it's this whole like despisal, and I would say disavowal of the body, because the body is in itself a boundary. It's a boundary in space, and it's in a boundary in time. And of course, as we learn to want a world without boundaries, we're really wanting the kind of world that Adam and Eve wanted in the garden, a world where we can be like God. I think about early in the pandemic, as so many of us, and I'm sure many of you can sort of relate to this, I felt incredible anxiety. And it wasn't anxiety that we would get sick necessarily. It wasn't anxiety necessarily for employment. It really wasn't even anxiety over our children. Like, they were fairly well situated with their school situation. I mean, it was just anxiety over time. Time itself was just upside down, and I didn't really have a sense of when it all was going to end and when was life going to return to normal. And of course, here we are a year later, and it's still not normal. But I think about like how initially I decided to engage that anxiety. What I did is I made all these lists of all these projects that I was going to do. But in order to make those lists, I decided I'm going to I'm going to organize all my stuff digitally. Like I am kind of a paper person. I've got this paper planner and I thought, but I also have a project management system that's digital. And I thought I'm going to switch everything digitally. Everything is going to be streamlined. And so I just started making list after list after list. And what happens when you go into that kind of those sort of project management things is you can just embed more and more and more things and file things away. It's boundless. You can keep boundless list of the things that you need to do. There's actually no boundary, like at least of a piece of paper gives you a boundary. You could get a second piece of paper and you could write more on your list, but there's absolutely no boundary to our digital list. And I just realized I was making more lists and I was only growing more anxious. And I realized that I have to actually impose upon myself a boundary. And for me, in terms of just time management, it was just returning to paper. It was just a simple kind of spiritual practice of saying, I can't do endless things. So that's one way that we're sort of, you probably have your own examples of how you're seduced kind of by this promise of boundless time, boundless capacity, boundless responsibility. I love Lawrence Scott's work. He has a book called Four-Dimensional Human: Ways of Being in a Digital World. And one of the things he talks about is how place is completely reoriented in our digital spaces. I mean, I could say I'm here, but where is here? Like, is here in my office here in Toronto, or is here actually here with you on this screen? Where are we right now? Are you in spring? Like, what are these digital spaces? Don't really allow us to map ourselves as easily as physical spaces. And the point of that is that it just leaves us with more and more responsibility, more relationships, more knowledge of crises in various parts of the world. And the interesting thing is that then if place is sort of amorphous, something that's very kind of vague and shadowy, then presence is something kind of optional and diluted and voluntary. Which means that, again, it sort of just kind of contributes to the acedia that we were just talking about. That if I can sort of opt in with my own presence, I get to opt in. Where will I choose to opt in? I'm going to choose to opt into the spaces that present me with the fewest burdens. We could talk about other sins of kind of this sense of boundlessness, sins of avarice. I don't even know actually how many books I ordered from Amazon. Like, I need to stop kind of that reflexive, like, I want that book. Okay, great. Order it from Amazon. Perfect. It's coming tomorrow. This kind of bound, like, I have access to so many things, sins of avarice, sins of gluttony, sins of lust, just over desiring things because they're available to me. What are the spiritual practices for this new world, this world of boundlessness? Well, we have to practice our limits. We have to practice the limits of our body, the limits of our place. We have to practice the limits of our knowledge. I think one of the things most recently for me is to realize how difficult it is to just say, I don't know. Because the internet, with the kind of the boundlessness of information, it makes you feel responsible to know everything. It makes you feel responsible to know if your friend from high school posted on Facebook that they have some tragedy. Like, if you find out later that you didn't know that, you sort of feel a guilt and a shame about that because you have boundless responsibility to all the people that you've ever known. How do you practice your limits? How do you say, I don't know? How do you just say, I can't do that? How do you practice Sabbath? This kind of retreat from the seduction of boundlessness, where you say, I have limited capacity and God's actually invited me to rest one day a week, digital Sabbaths included. How do you practice place? Not kind of that just vague and shadowy, well, here, what does here mean? Well, here actually means in my neighborhood, in my community, in my city? Who are the people that I can love most immediately? And then what are the burdens that I will need to take up for their care? There's a lot of hope, I think, as I sort of tie up my talk here today. I talked about these three dimensions of the crisis of perception. How do you resist the things that you can't see? Well, the good news is that this is kind of the business that Jesus is in, is healing sight, allowing us to be the kinds of people who have a healthy eye, is actually as it's talked about in Sermon on the Mount, where you are full of light and you can see rightly in the world. In John chapter 9, we have the story of the blind man who Jesus healed. And it's wonderful to know that this was actually one of the most painted stories in the ancient Christian catacombs. This was kind of like the story to talk about spiritual transformation and conversion. It's the healing of sight. And so while we may not be able to always see the ways that our desires are disordered, the ways that our expectations of the world are disordered because of our technologies, Jesus sees and knows, and he heals. He can heal our sight, and we can ask him for that. The crisis of habituation. How do we resist the things that we practice? Well, the wonderful thing about Christianity, again, sort of a very simple sort of frame, if you will, for spiritual transformation is putting off and putting on, practicing, like leaving off old practices and habits, which is going to be what I'm talking about a lot on Wednesday. So join me on Wednesday evening. Putting off doubtful habits, sinful habits, and learning to practice new things. And this is something that the Apostle Paul, this is language that he used. Practice these things, put them, imitate me, keep doing these things. The God of peace will be with you. And just the crisis of desire. And I think this is the most important one. Because as I've told you, that our technology now is forming in us desires for a burdenless world. I think only the Holy Spirit can give us a desire for burdens. A desire, we're being formed for a world that is boundless, and there's an endless seduction to that. Only the Holy Spirit can give us a desire, a recognition and a gratitude for limits. But we know that the Christian project isn't just the reformation of our thinking. It's not just the reformation of our behaving. It really is the reformation of our desiring. That just as Christ was raised from the dead, we are raised to walk in newness of life. And so I just want to encourage you to choose life, choose the burdens that are involved with life, choose the limits that are involved with life. I've gotten most recently very interested in the theme of trees in scripture. And I was listening to a lecture, this man who, actually Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, you can go listen to it, talked about in the Garden of Eden. It sort of sets up kind of the whole frame for the entire biblical story, that there is a tree of life and there is a tree of death. And by God's grace, we'll be able to see which tree actually gives us life. I have actually added these slides into my website. I've also included a resource page on my website, and you can find that there. And so I'd encourage you to find me. I said that I was going to use the chat, which I ended up not doing because I couldn't see it once I had shared my screen. And so I'm very happy to take any questions that you have now. Thanks so much for your attention. And I will stop sharing here.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. When you were starting to talk about resistance, I was thinking, how much we need to recover like an old language of gluttony and idolatry, and of course you went right there. I think you're exactly right. The more things change, the more they stay the same. It's the same old desires. Maybe they're manifesting themselves in different ways, but it's the same same things. And so I think you've given all of us a lot to think about here. You've really, I think, reoriented our understanding of resistance, I think we hear a lot, we need to resist the world, but maybe not in the ways that you were expressing today, is in kind of an everyday kind of way, and that the dangers of getting tied up in idolatry are all around us, and a kind of everyday idolatry that I think you were calling us to be on guard against. So thank you so much for that. So I do want to open it up for questions now. I would say if you want to ask a question live, which is encouraged, please show yourself on mute, obviously, but feel free to show that face live for our guest, but also feel free to put questions in the chat too.
Hi there. I just have to say I really enjoyed your presentation, so thank you for that. I've just seen, it's crazy, because I think about these things sometimes, but not necessarily the practical ways to combat them like you were telling us to. And I really do feel like, for me personally, I get really nostalgic all the time, and people probably think I'm crazy because of that. But I know, like, in my life personally, it's something that I kind of miss, people not being so distracted on their phones and just having access to everything they want all the time. I really appreciate the different ways you gave us to combat those desires with our technology. I was just wondering if you had any more like practical examples by chance. I loved what you said about like cooking and caring for children. Do you have any other ways that we could branch out?
Yeah, I think walking is a really important one. Like when you can choose to forego the car and you can actually just walk somewhere, get there a little bit more slowly, engage like the burden of like, if you live in a climate as we do, you have to zip up your coat and put on your hat. And it's just a way to sort of feel your body in the world. And honestly, like a lot of it is like caring for your place, like you're doing your laundry, these things that we have to do. And I think it's probably a matter of attitude as well, that it may be things that you're currently doing, like the dishes, the laundry, the, whatever you do for your friend to love them, where you actually like engage your body in some way, like you go pick up flowers and you drop them off, or you make them a meal, caring for your neighbor by making a meal for them and then walking it over to their door and standing at the doorstep and talking to them for 5 or 10 minutes, when what you really want to do is you want to send a text. You want to be like, I really love that person today. I sent them a text. And I think that text can be wonderful ways to love your friends and love your neighbors. I just think that they're like they're not past that threshold of I engaged like a physical burden. I took up some friction to love them. So anything like that, having a digital Sabbath is really, really good, where you put your phone to sleep for a day, sundown to sundown, Saturday to Sunday or whatever. Or if that just feels so just crazy to even think about, do it for 2 hours, and then I think the point is that until you create a little bit of space, you don't even have the wherewithal to see what could be available, because you have to like put off the technology so you can put on something else. So those are some other ways. In a lot of ways, my life kind of just naturally inclines to like bodily effort. Like I have 5 kids, I got to make dinner, I got to drive them to school. And the interesting thing though, is I think for young people is to know that those are going to be good burdens ahead for them. Like marriage and parenting are really good burdens, but they do involve us with burdens. And I think it's really important to think about too, how often we don't, like people are afraid of those burdens. afraid of those entanglements. And so the more you can practice burdens, the more you can just say, this is good, because this is what the work of love requires, then it could be anything.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
More questions?
Hi. I just had a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. When practicing these good burdens, I'm just wondering, because it's easy to do these activities, but still, you know, like mentally have, say, a negative attitude, like you're trying to do it and you're just like, I'm just wondering how you combat your, like
negative thoughts.
Yeah, negative thoughts, like how you, get a positive outlook on it as you're doing them, because I realize not always are we going to be super eager. You know what I'm saying?
I absolutely know what you're saying. I'm so glad you asked this question, because a lot of times, like, we wonder, should we wait until like we feel really sincere about it? You know, should I wait to take that meal to my neighbor, or, you know, help my friend in some way that like engages a physical effort? Should I wait till I want to do that? And because we don't want to do things that are just hypocritical. We don't want to just like go through the motions. But the interesting thing is, like, sometimes the motions actually lead to the desire. And so when you practice the habits of bodily burden, if you will, like, you might be in the middle of doing it and going, oh, this is so frustrating and inconvenient. I can literally, like, that happens to me probably every day, where I'm like, oh, why do people get hungry in this house? And I actually have to make dinner. And, you know, people, I have like just the annoyance of how people leave the sink really dirty. And I come and I think, why can't anybody else like just wash down their food, you know, and just clear out the sink, you know? And then what do I do in that moment? Like, sometimes I just grumble. But then, you know, sometimes like I think that I do it, and then, you know, maybe it's later in the day when honestly, a lot of it happens in prayer. You're just like, God, I think what it is like a confession that you feel entitled to a life without it. Where you're just like, I feel God entitled to like a really good, easy, burden-free life. Like, I sort of feel like everybody should serve me. And then you think of a scripture like, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then, you know, maybe it's, God, help me to have that attitude. Maybe that's the verse that you put, you know, on your mirror, or you put on your phone and it's your home screen. How ironic, right? Put it on your home screen. But anything to kind of remind yourself of like how you can connect the dots. Because I think you're right. If you just do it and you never try to connect the desire to it, you're probably only going to get halfway there. Like, you're going to do it and that's going to hopefully form some of the desire. But the more you can kind of bring in like scripture, or just acts like prayer, where you say, this, Lord, I want you to form this attitude in me, because I don't have it. And I don't think any of us do. And I think even if we didn't have technology, we would find ways of avoiding the burdens and the demands of love. Like, that's just kind of what it means to be human. Great question, though.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Jen. Thank you for a great presentation. I really appreciate that. It's shocking to hear that, you know, something like sex is too much work. Can't be bothered to have sex with actually another human being. So I'll just take care of that myself. You know, I can't, you know, that. I guess a related question, you've talked about being a mother, and I might be wrong in the statistics here, but I think, is it the case that in lots of highly industrialized and very technologies, cultures that are high in their technological fluency, isn't it the case that birth rates are going down, and even the people's desire, there was a day in lots of nations where you would just assume that you would probably get married and have children, and I think we see that those numbers are going down. I just wonder if there's any correlation, like in your study, if we can't be burdened with lots of things, is one of those burdens that we're not sure we want anymore, is the burden of children. Are there correlations between these this data that's saying, yeah, people are less and less interested in that, and what you're talking about with we don't want more friction than we have to have.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a wonderful question. And I think Jeffrey Bilbrough is going to love that I'm going to talk about Wendell Berry, sex, freedom, community economy, whatever that essay is, like, so good, really, really important here. Because he talks about like the natural kind of limits and burdens involved in human relationships. And so the more that you move toward autonomy as an ideal, the less and less you want kind of the burdens and the constraints of human relationships, whether that's family life, marriage, parenting. And I think it's absolutely true that we see with industrialized technological societies despising the burdens that are the entanglements of human community in all of its forms. And it's interesting because there's a pastor in my church who's doing some research right now on gender. His PhD is addressing, some gender issues and stuff. And he's talking a lot about the changes that happen as soon as we conceive of the sovereign self. This is a relatively new ideal, right? I mean, 2000 years ago, people saw your primary identity was as it related to other people, right? Who you were in your family, who you were in your community, the sense that you had kind of your own sort of individual freedoms and preferences. That just wasn't even a conception necessarily. So when you have the rise of the autonomous self, Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, like they're kind of giving accounts of this. As you have the rise of the autonomous self, then you now have a whole new way that people can conceive of their lives, right? And truthfully, birth control is a technology too, right? So as soon as people are able to sort of exercise some form of control in terms of how many children they have and when they have them, and of course that control we could argue is fairly illusory in a lot of ways, because you might be able to prevent a child getting pregnant, but you can't always make it happen, right? So we have far less control than we think we do. But I think it's very, very important. That's actually why I said that. Whenever I talk to young people, I want to say, like, marriage is a wonderful burden. God actually said marriage is good. Yes, it entangles us. Yes, it gives us limits and constraints and burdens, but it's really good. And that's why we have to train ourselves for burdens, for saying that they're good. And same with parenting. So I think your question is a really good one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Got time for more questions? I like that cereal is part of the slow food movement. I understand that though. I've just recently gotten back into cereal because I was off it for a long time because it just took too much time. Just give me a bar, maybe some milk, and I can go. But cereal, I mean, you got to take the box and put it in you got to get the bowl and the spoon, and yeah, this is a lot of work.
And you know what? Then you go to eggs. Like, we're an egg family. So, and God forbid a homemade muffin or something. But these are good burdens to practice.
Hi, thank you so much for your words, and it's a fantastic message. I work in student development, and so for me, I guess just one basic question is, how do we balance from a programmatic perspective at our institution, if we're trying to think about ways to help students grow and help our faculty and staff grow in these directions, how do you balance the desire, the want and the need? That we feel like students need this. We want to build this in programmatically as an institution, but the desire, and I know you talked a little bit about desire and just the habits there, but I mean, I think back to there's an old Saturday Night Live skit where there's basketball recruiters, you know, and there's the old school, there's the new school, and they go to this house and they're trying to recruit basketball athletes, and they're like, you know, come and have all that you want, and the money and the scholarships and all that stuff. And then the other coach is like, you know, you're going to get beat up like with a sock full of nickels, and we're going to make you tough, and, you know, and nobody wants that anymore. So how do you balance at this kind of level, as opposed to personal necessarily, but, you know, chapel requirement versus chapel invitation, chapel, or anything related to the things that people need versus how do we instill that desire?
That is such a good question. This is a question that I'm asking as I raise my own teenagers, you know, is how do you kind of help them connect the dots, that this isn't just a drudgery, this actually is an invitation to life. And I wonder if it's just helping people to engage some new habits and then pay attention to the dividends of those habits. So what, you know, maybe it's you putting your phones, like having people enter the cafeteria and then the phones are baskets in the middle of the tables or whatever. And I don't know if you already do something like that, any kinds of thing. And then you ask people like, how does your conversation change when people actually leave their phones in their backpacks, you know, or they put them in the baskets, like where you can help people actually start to taste and see? Because the thing is that there are rewards to the things that we're talking about. They're just not as immediate, and we have to almost look for them. And that's the thing about the gratification piece of it. I mean, we really are talking about brain science here. You know, every time you pick up your smartphone, right, and you get a nice little notification, you get a hit of dopamine, you feel like you're loved in the world. And helping people kind of have new experiences of being loved, of being seen, of being welcomed, and then paying attention to that as it relates to a more digital kind of saccharine kind of substitute. It's not easy. I think it really is a work of prayer too, you know, and bearing testimony, you know, in your own life. But this is just, I have become convinced that discipleship, we talk so much, like I actually I've used this analogy with my kids, that if you think about faith as something to grow, think about that plant. And, you know, there are things that you have to give to the plants for it to grow. This is like my new pandemic thing. I'm growing a lot of plants and it's kind of fun. And I'm not killing all of them. So that's even more fun. So you give your plant certain things, but you also have to give your plant the right conditions. It's not just give your plant water, it's set your plant by the right window. And I think that's the institutional piece of it, is the window. It's the room. It's the, you know, it's the air, it's the atmosphere, and it's really the conditions. And one of the amazing things too is just when you have more of a self-contained environment. I don't know exactly how self-contained your campus is, like how many commuters you have or residential students, but you have some opportunities to imagine how to change the conditions. And I actually think, you know, we think that our kids can't, you know, our students can't be without their devices. Like they can, we did it before, right? So I think your question is such a good one. I'm not sure if I'm answering it correctly, but what a wonderful conversation to be having.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, you know, where the resistance needs to take place. There's been a stress in the presentation on kind of the individual strategies that we can take. And I'm wondering how much, returning to kind of an older understanding of vice and resistance demands a critique, honestly, of consumer capitalism. And I don't necessarily mean going and shutting Madison Avenue down, but I think we do have to recognize we live in a world where millions of people get paid to try to disorder our desires.
Yes.
To mess us up, right? I had a former student on Facebook asking, question, what advice would you give for buying a home? And my advice, and I thought it was the most profound wisdom I could give, was buy a house you can afford, which sounds crazy, but in our society, that's probably revolutionary. To buy a house you can afford, buy a phone you can afford, buy a dishwasher you can afford. And I say that the perversity in many ways of our consumer society is if we all started only buying the things we could afford, our economy would probably collapse and we would have massive unemployment. And I'd probably be out of a job because people couldn't send their students to school anymore. But sacrifices have to be made maybe to rightly order our desires. So how far do we need to take this resistance, I guess?
I think it's a point really well taken that an individual can only do so much. And to actually return to that Ezra Klein interview with Cal Newport, that was sort of what Ezra wanted to say to Cal about his most recent book, A World Without Email, because he's like, now you're actually talking about institutional change. You're not just talking about individual resistance, like deep work and digital minimalism, because that's only going to go so far. I mean, you may, want to not be on Slack all day, but if you work for a corporation where that's required of you, like you can only practice so much resistance, right? And I think, in church, it's a huge point of discussion, like how much will we mediate what we do? Now, of course, we're in a pandemic, so my church is mediating everything. The weekly service, every class, everything is online. But I'm lamenting a little bit because now, before we were always a paper bulletin, from a very deliberate sort of resistance to looking at your smartphone during the service, or bring a Bible and then look at your bulletin and don't look at a screen, and just trying to avoid ways to mediate our spiritual experiences through a screen. But I think consumerism is a huge piece of this. Like, I've been really intrigued by this whole idea that the way that we love our cities well in a pandemic is that we keep buying from local businesses. Like, it's just buying. It's consumerism as solution. And in some, I don't want my local bakery to go out, and I do want to patronize these businesses, but I think we have to, when every solution is consumer driven, then it sort of begs the question, like, really, is that really the problem? Are we going to just buy our way out of particular problems? But I think the previous question and this one is really good, that we have to think beyond the individual to the institutional. And I think, universities have an opportunity to form the leaders of the next generation, to think about ways that we can do business differently. It's interesting. I remember, I think one of the things, and maybe I have this in the next presentation, but there are legislative initiatives to curb people's appetites for social media, for example, and because we know how that has gone awry in terms of the spread of disinformation. And I think that we have to keep the Christian perspective that the external constraints will only do so much, because vice is to think about the internal, the mechanism of the heart, which towards corruption. And so I think that, I guess I do want to say it's a both and, but I think the desire piece of it, that's why liturgy and habit allows us to kind of engage both sides of it, because habit is the way we form our desires. It's a hinge of desire. We practice our way into the things that we love. We always think we don't just practice the things we love. The things we practice are the things that we come to love. So habit is a way to talk about how can you form new desires, but the goal is always not to just have the habit, but to have the right desire. So it is that kind of internal, external piece at the same time. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's a good one.
We have time for maybe one more question. Anything you wanted to ask us, Jen?
Ooh. I don't think so, but it's great. It's great to talk about. It's actually great to talk about because this is not something that I come from a place of, well, I've got this all figured out. Like I'm struggling as much as anybody else with the formation of disordered desires and the formation of better habits to lead to better desires. So I feel very much that I'm a co-learner.
Well, the nice thing is we get to continue this conversation with you on Wednesday. So thank you so much for being part of our focus today. And Jen and Michel will be back on Wednesday. I wanted to say a quick shout out to Jeff Bilbrow and Tom Holzinger-Friesen, who did the initial work of getting Jen and our other keynote speaker, Alan Noble, here and putting this together. So it's been a really amazing start to our focus week. So thank you so much for being a part of it. So just continue to check for everyone, continue to check the focus schedule. We have some more excellent keynotes coming up this week. And then of course, a whole slate of faculty workshops on Wednesday and Friday. So hope to see you again. We say what is it on Zoom? A clap for Jen and appreciation for. I'll raise my hand so you can visibly see. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to being able to talk with you again on Wednesday. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.